Utah completed its legislative session recently. So what actually passed and how will it impact you and I?
Recognition of these facts, that the voters care most about what is broadly impacting them, particularly, on a day-to-day basis, their kids, their families, their finances, and we ought to focus our energies most there.
On this episode, we sit down with Sutherland Institute's team of policy experts to discuss which bills were passed on issues like religious freedom, family policy, education, and elections. We're also going to give you a preview of the issues that likely voters will prioritize this election year. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about Utah's legislative session. We just completed another 45 days of discussions and debates around various issues affecting the people of Utah. So on this episode, we're going to give a quick recap over what kinds of things passed, specifically what Sutherland Institute was involved with, and some of the issue areas that are priorities for Sutherland that had legislation passed that will benefit the lives of Utahns. To start off this conversation, we're joined in the studio by Stan Rasmussen. He's the Vice President of Government Affairs here at Sutherland Institute. Stan, thanks so much for being with us.
Appreciate the opportunity, Nick.
So I wanted to start with you first to get kind of an overview of some of the legislation that our legislators passed this past session that just recently concluded. You were, of course, up there in the thick of it every session for these 45 days. I've heard you joke and others joke that it's kind of like a sprint and a marathon combined because there's a lot that happens in a compact time frame, but it can be tiring and exciting and sometimes stressful and all those things in between. So I want to first kind of get your take on what are some of the issues, what do people need to know of what passed during this legislative session, specifically things that Sutherland Institute was involved with? What are some of the issue areas that you think we saw some improvements, some steps forward?
Sure. Well, thanks, Nick. Our focus was on areas that fall within our policy priorities. Generally, those include family policy, education, elections, and religious freedom. And there were significant measures considered and passed during this session. In particular, I mentioned the resolution about the success sequence, and that began in the Senate, concluded in the House. And that, very briefly, what the success sequence is about is, in fact, the resolution encouraged the state board to consider finding ways to bring discussion about this important element into curriculum for grades 6 through 12. The success sequence basically is this. If a young person will get an education, preferably graduate from high school, then a full-time job, and then if they're going to have children, get married first, those that do that experience something very significant. They avoid poverty about 97% of the time. Now, when we talk about those things, some have concerns that, gosh, what light does that put people in who have maybe grown up in a home setting where that wasn't modeled? The intent is not to provide or to give any cast any shade or put them in a bad light, but the point is to emphasize that those who choose this course, particularly these steps in that sequence, can prepare themselves for a life of prosperity. A life of prosperity and avoid poverty. So that was an important measure that we're pleased to see enacted.
You mentioned a couple things. So the success sequence and legislation around supporting families and also religious freedom. I just want to tie a thread together that those, and there are some other things as well that we'll get into more detail later in this episode with some of our policy scholars here at Sutherland to expand on each of these pieces of legislation. But Stan, it strikes me that there's something that ties together all those things that education, work, family, religious freedom, and participating in civic institutions like faith organizations, workplaces, schools, all these kinds of things. These are sort of core bedrock principles and institutions of the United States since its founding. And so it's I think, beneficial that there were steps forward here in Utah in our legislature to strengthen and bolster those institutions. Did that seem to be sort of resonant up there? Do the legislators, when they're passing these kinds of bills, do they have that view of, well, we're supporting sort of the foundations of a functional society with some of these things?
Yes, I think so. In fact, it's interesting, in my view, that legislators, whether in the House or the Senate, are representatives of their constituents, but they also have another constituency. Primarily, it's those who elected them in their geographic areas, but they also have concerns and responsibility for the state as a whole. And so to your question, yes, I think there's a general sense that these things matter, and they do have touch points, and they do work together in a collaborative sense. I'll just mention a couple of other areas that fall within the purview of what we've just talked about. A bill formally created the Office of Families. Within the past couple of years, Governor Cox has established an Office of Families within his administration. This bill had the effect of creating a formal home, if you will, within the Department of Health and Human Services for those functions to operate. And part of that legislation also calls for data being provided to, requested and provided to the Office of Families that they will then in turn make available to policymakers to inform and equip them to make sound decisions to the benefit of families. And another one would be in the area of religious freedom. A bill was enacted, the title of which is Exercise of Religion Amendments. And that is basically a Utah RFRA, if you will.
And RFRA being the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, I'll remind listeners, we did an episode on this with Senator Todd Weiler, who is the Senate sponsor for that bill, and Bill Duncan, our Religious Freedom and Constitutional Law Fellow here at Sutherland, to dive into that. And Stan, as I mentioned, we'll get into more of these details throughout this episode. We're going to bring on a number of our policy experts to talk about each of these areas in more specificity. But before we let you go, I want to ask you and really make the comment that it is so easy for people to criticize the legislature. It's sort of an American pastime, right? We like criticizing elected officials, and to a large extent, rightfully so, because it's our job to hold them accountable and make sure they're doing things that are responsive to residents. But I think the thing I see the most often, that I'll be honest, sometimes is a little bit frustrating, is that if there are people out there who all they see is maybe some headlines during the legislative session about what the legislature has done, and that prompts them to think a certain way about it and maybe be critical. I mean, you've been deeply involved with the legislature for many years. For me and some of my past work as well, it's been a lot of fun to be up there deeply involved in this process. So I want to get your take on, for folks out there who don't do this kind of thing for a living, who are just seeing the headlines and seeing the news reports, and maybe it is sometimes easy to feel a little bit critical or frustrated with what happens at the legislature, recognizing they're not perfect, but they're overall good people trying to do a good service for the people of Utah. What's the one thing that our listeners out there need to remember, need to walk away with knowing about the legislature and about these people who we elect to represent us each January?
Great question, and I appreciate it. It's a remarkable process, and I think something that is important for us to understand. And part of the criticism is, my gosh, look at what they do. Hundreds of bills are filed, and a high majority of those are enacted in a short period of time, 45 days. And I liken it to the harvest season. So we have a full year of process wherein legislators meet in town hall meetings with their constituents. They meet in task forces with their colleagues, interim committee meetings. They're meeting regularly with constituents, whether it's school boards or chambers of commerce or just neighbors that they encounter at the grocery store. They are constantly focusing on these things, but the only time that they can enact legislation is during a session. And those typically are the general session, 45 days, January to March. Occasionally there are special sessions, but those are much more limited in scope. So we see this significant, intensive effort toward within the 45 days. Well, we don't criticize farmers for an intensive couple of weeks or few weeks of harvest, because that's what it takes. So what we're seeing here is the culmination of weeks and months of effort to develop and refine these concepts into a final piece of legislation.
Well, Stan, I want to thank you for joining us today to talk about some of this, and also for everything you do for Sutherland up on Utah's Capitol Hill. It's a lot of work, and you do it well, and we're so grateful to have you up there. And again, helping our listeners understand a little bit about the process and some of the issues that we'll dive into more throughout this episode.
Thanks, Nick. And I'll just make this final observation. our representatives and senators not only technically represent us because they've been elected to do so, they reflect us. There is a broad spectrum of background there. We have people who are in the medical field. We have doctors, a nurse, a pharmacist. We have teachers, farmers and ranchers, business people, real estate, entrepreneurs. They bring a broad spectrum of experience and insight, and that's essential to the process. And so we need to respect the fact that they have lives, they're working, they have families, but they focus on this in this 45-day intensive segment and of time, and they do great work, in my view, in preserving the foundations of our functional culture here in Utah.
Well, Stan, thank you very much. We're going to actually dive into some of those issues as we go, but thanks again for being with us on Defending Ideas.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So one of the things we want to talk about is, what does this mean moving forward for each of us as residents of Utah? What were some of the policies that were implemented through legislation in the areas of things like education and family and work and religious freedom and elections that's going to affect the rest of us this year and in future years? So with that, we're now pleased to be joined by Christine Cook Fairbanks. She is the Education Policy Fellow for us here at Sutherland Institute. We're going to talk about some of the education bills that were passed this session and what that means for Utahns. Christine, thanks so much for joining us on Defending Ideas.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So I want to mention something first. There's some brand new survey data from Sutherland Institute released in our new issue brief about Utah likely voter priorities relevant to the 2024 election, and we'll link to this in the show notes. But there's one thing I want to mention to kind of frame the conversation. When likely voters in Utah were asked what their top issues were, one of the top issues, in fact, it was second from the top, is education funding. The only thing that beat that was housing affordability. So I want to start there. Education in general, and of course education funding, it's very top of mind for voters here in Utah. It's constantly and consistently been a very high priority for Utah voters. So as you look back at the session that we just completed, was this a good year for education in Utah so far?
It was a good year for education in Utah. And, money as far as a priority has always been a big priority in Utah. There's a lot of debate about whether or not we're spending enough. We have a low per pupil amount. Other people defend that, saying we have a very high value in what we get out of our education spending. And so that's not surprising to see that. But I think Utah has a good approach to education and really kind of maximizing what we do use and focusing on the right things. So this session, there were a couple of bills that Sutherland really focused on. So there was the Education Entities Amendments Bill, which gave some clarity around micro schools. So micro schools are relatively new in the education landscape, but they're not completely new. And so they already exist. But this bill gave municipalities, so cities and towns, definitions of how to regulate these micro schools. Obviously, this is a boon to micro school leaders because it allows them to understand the parameters and so that they can exist. So that's a win for students that want micro schools. And the reason why this has become such a high priority is because last year, obviously, Utah passed the Utah Fits All Scholarship. That funding will enable more families to pay for micro schools if they want it. So it's kind of put that topic at the top of the list in terms of urgency to make sure that micro schools can exist and that everyone can understand how they can function or be regulated going forward. And then we also focused on a joint resolution on the success sequence. And Sutherland has put out a lot of information on the success sequence, which is basically if you graduate from high school, get a full-time job, and then marry before having children, you can avoid poverty, or 97% avoid poverty. So that's a huge data point that's really important. A lot of different research institutions cite that of all types of stripes and political leanings. And so the goal here was to send a message that this is important to Utah and it ought to be taught to students. And obviously a resolution doesn't have the force of law. There's no mandate or enforcement mechanism, but it is a sign of intent. And it does ask and encourage the state board to take a look at their standards and say, how can you incorporate this into some standards, and even LEAs at the district level, how can they incorporate this into instruction? So this was a big win as far as just focus and kind of a trajectory forward of bringing this to public schools in Utah.
Christine, let me ask you about that, because there's something interesting about both of those two examples. So this new legislation supporting micro schools and then the resolution promoting the success sequence. On one hand, the success sequence, that's a time-tested set of life milestones that, as you illustrated, very strongly correlate with avoiding poverty. Education, work, and marriage before kids. It's something that has been studied for many years. So it's, again, kind of this long-term, time-tested set of ideas that can help people be successful. But then micro schools is something that's very new and innovative. So it's interesting to me that on the one hand, we're saying, hey, let's sort of revive this set of traditional ideas that the data is overwhelming that these things will help you avoid poverty 97% of the time. And then over here, we've got a brand new, innovative new way to teach people in the form of micro schools that it just strikes me that we sort of have this blend of holding to time-tested principles and also trying new things. It seems that those ideas are sometimes in conflict with one another. Either, well, let's go back to how things used to be, or let's move forward. But it's interesting that this is sort of a combination of both. Do you see a connection between, again, this idea of these long-standing principles that have proven to be successful, and, well, let's still innovate in our education system? Maybe it's not enough to simply say, do these things and work hard and you'll be okay. Why is there still a need for innovation in how we're teaching with things like micro schools? I know that leads into issues of educational choice that you've researched and worked a lot on, but help us kind of put all that in context together. As what is Utah's education vision when it's doing things in all these various buckets?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I think that you can have innovation within a larger principle. And so I think the larger principle here is parent-driven education. While micro schools might be the newest iteration of parents being involved, maybe even directly in education, there is a long history in the United States of parents directing education. So directly funding it or directly delivering it in sort of a homeschool setting. The micro school is kind of this blend of often it's homeschooling families that want to pay for an instructor to come and teach on certain subjects. And this really has grown out of the pandemic, although they existed before. But the pandemic was definitely a catalyst for parent-driven education. And I think people's awareness of micro schools, the demand for it, and then even the legislature's reaction or even maybe preparation, I would say, going forward, all kind of grows out of that tradition of parents being directly involved in education.
So what are some of the other things that we need to know about the legislative session that just occurred? As you mentioned, Sutherland was closely involved with the resolution promoting the success sequence, this legislation that's giving some regulatory structure around micro schools so they can function efficiently and effectively and know what their parameters are to continue to improve upon that innovative model. Other highlights that our listeners need to know, that these are some of the key things that happened this past session with respect to improving our education system here in Utah.
Yeah, so I saw two buckets, really. Their education bills are ever growing. So there were a lot of things that happened in education, but from the perspective of some of the things that we were watching and cared about, there's this education choice refinement. That's what I'm calling it. And it's really looking at the past work of creating education choice options or scholarships in the state and then just making them even better. So there is a bill to tweak the Utah Fits All scholarship, which obviously launches officially in the fall. But the sponsor of the bill even said that, they gave it that year run up so that they could understand what some of the bugs were, what some of the issues were, and could address them this session. Part of it was expanding eligibility. So now military families can also be eligible. Families that are fostering children but are in the process of trying to adopt can now be eligible. A really key piece of this cleanup bill was to address where the funding could go. So it can't just go directly to an individual or, say, a parent. It has to go to a service provider. And so in this way, you couldn't have a homeschool parent getting paid to homeschool their kids, right? So there's some concerns about that, setting some limitations. It clarified the appeals process. created some coordination between the tax commission and the program manager so they can prioritize low-income families and things like that. So that was really helpful. There was another bill that combined two different education choice programs specifically directed towards special needs students. So there's the Carson Smith Scholarship. That's a traditional voucher, passed in 2004. And then in 2018, there was a special needs opportunity scholarship as a tax credit scholarship. And the idea was to combine them. There were some I guess, hiccups in both in terms of one had more funding than students and more students than funding and some other things. So they combined them. It will get a new name, which is the Carson Smith Scholarship. And nobody, they did a good job of making sure that nobody is sort of left behind in this. It's built in to gradually phase out one and bring in the other. So that was really helpful. And in terms of teachers, there were a flurry of bills that were aimed at prioritizing teacher issues. Whether that was trying to help increase pay, creating a hotline for teachers, mandating postpartum paid leave for a few weeks, changing how teachers are evaluated. So removing chronically absent students. The idea there is you can't teach students that don't show up to class, so they should be part of the evaluation for teachers. So a lot of those things really just addressed teachers. And honestly, I do think that if we can't get the teacher portion right or we don't prioritize it, I think a lot of other education issues won't get advanced as well because you have to kind of take care of both sides.
Christine, one of the things you've said before and have written about before is this idea of we can't and we shouldn't pit various aspects of our education system against one another. And that's reflected in the Utah Fits All Scholarship because it also included raises for teachers in that legislation. And so this idea that it's not parents versus teachers or traditional K-12 schools versus things like micro schools or other innovative approaches, all of these things need to work together as part of a robust system. And to me, that seems reflected in the fact that the legislature, they promoted the success sequence and took initial steps to have that be incorporated in the curriculum. They supported innovation by providing some structure for micro schools and then addressing issues of choice to continue to refine education choice and supporting teachers in this way. So it seems like the legislature has still sort of held up to that education as a broad system, we want to support all the various parts about it. And I want to see if we can draw a connection between what was done this session, these bills that you walked through, and we'll provide some links in the show notes if folks want to dig deeper on these things. But moving forward, so the session just recently ended. We had all this legislation that was passed, but these issues are still important to voters. We mentioned at the beginning that education, as you said, it's usually always a big topic of the legislature. So there are still education issues that are going to be top of mind for voters. We're, of course, in an election year. So moving forward, I want to go back to this issue brief that we just put out from Sutherland, asking likely voters in Utah what their top priorities are. And the question was asked, that they were given a list of issues and asked to rank in order of priority in terms of how it will affect your vote. So number one would be, this is the most important issue. It's really going to affect who I vote for this election year. And 9 would be the lowest. So 1 to 9, and we'll link to this so folks can read it, but education funding was a 3.8. So it's right in the top tier of issues that are vital for likely voters. And then curriculum transparency was a 5.36. So a little bit lower, kind of in mid-tier. I just want to ask you, number one, does anything surprise you about these survey findings? And what thoughts would you have for members of the press, for policymakers, and for all of us as voters in terms of how we ought to be thinking about education issues throughout this coming election year?
It doesn't surprise me that education funding is near the top, as I mentioned. That strikes me as reflective of the conversations that's been going on for years. It was a little surprising to see DEI issues ranking so low, just with regard to how much it was in the news cycle, especially in Utah, and what happened in the legislature. And obviously DEI spans from employment to education, all types of things. The last year was really this nationally, this push for parents' rights, and that often did butt up against some of these DEI type movements or principles that would kind of make their way into schools. So that was interesting to me. But I think what sort of balances it out is that in that middle tier, as you mentioned, there was interest in curriculum transparency. It wasn't the highest, but it definitely made that middle tier in terms of priority. And I think it does kind of grow out of the DEI concerns, maybe, but it can be broader than that, as well as just having this kind of parent-teacher relationship being restored in education. And the polling data also shows that for different groups, something like curriculum transparency did kind of rise to the top, right? So those who were 65 years or older cared a lot about it, or Republicans cared a lot about it. So you do kind of see maybe more conservative demographics that ranked it even higher. But on average, it still, was something of importance to likely voters.
Well, Christina, we appreciate your time. This episode, we're going to try and get through a lot of different legislative issues, but any final thoughts for our listeners, the election year ahead of us when it comes to education policy, any words of encouragement? How can we make sure that each of us as voters fulfilling our civic duty and the way we talk with our elected officials, how can we make sure that these education issues we care about are addressed in the right way or continue to be prioritized in the way that they should? Any final thoughts for the coming year on education policy?
Yeah, election years, it's really easy to get caught up in the politics rather than maybe the policies of what's happening. And that's especially true at the presidential level. But I would say keep researching, keep asking questions, keep reaching out to make sure that education is a high priority. There are a lot of things. There's a lot of work to do and a lot of space for improvement and reform. And so it's worth kind of keeping our eye on the ball in terms of keeping it on policy.
Well, Christine, thank you again for your time and being with us on this episode of Defending Ideas.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That's Christine Cook Fairbanks, the Education Policy Fellow here at Sutherland Institute. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to dive into religious freedom, family, elections, a lot more to come on this recap of the legislative session in the year 2024 here in Utah, and what that means for these issues moving forward in the rest of this election year. This is Defending Ideas. Stick around.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn, and we're going to continue our conversation about what exactly happened during this year's legislative session here in the state of Utah, and what kinds of bills were passed with respect to things like education, religious freedom, family, and elections. And we're going to continue that conversation, but first I want to remind you, if you're enjoying what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org. You can subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, any of the major platforms. Wherever you like to listen to your shows, just search for Defending Ideas and click subscribe. You can also watch on YouTube at the Sutherland Institute YouTube channel and also subscribe there, and also get access to short clips from this episode and previous discussions that you can use in your conversations with friends and family, and also clips that you can share on your social media channels as you continue to engage on these important issues. All that and more can access at defendingideas.org. Well, now we're pleased to sit down with Bill Duncan. He's the Constitutional Law and Religious Freedom Fellow here at Sutherland Institute. Bill, thanks for coming back on Defending Ideas.
Thanks, Nick.
So I wanted to talk to you about religious freedom specifically. We just talked with Christine about some of the education bills that passed this session, and religious freedom is another one of those issues that sometimes it may not feel as immediately impactful to your average voter or your average family in the way that something like education policy is. But it's also really foundational and fundamental to the American experiment, to our system of government, and to our culture here in this country. So I want to ask you about what kinds of bills passed this session with respect to religious freedom. What are some of the highlights that you would view maybe as policy wins this session?
Oh, well, I think you're exactly right. And I think Utah pays a lot of attention to this topic because they want to avoid creating conflicts, which is really a positive thing. So this year, and I think this has been one of the most impactful ones in the sense that we finally passed a law similar to a law passed in the U.S. Congress in the early 90s called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And Utah now has its own called Religious Exercise Amendments, which specifies that if a government agency creates a burden on someone else's ability to practice their religion, that burden will be it cannot be enforced unless the government can show there's an extremely good reason and there's really no other way that it can accomplish that purpose. Other than creating a burden on someone's religious freedom. So it's really important in the situations where maybe it's a religious minority and their views are not maybe widely understood, and it gives them protection from burdens that may inadvertently be put on their religious practice. So that's a key one. The other two are similar to one another, a little more specific. One has to do with, it was House Bill 396, and it had to do with employees. You may remember that the U.S. Supreme Court last term handed down a decision in which they said that if kind of creating a similar rule for employees, if their religious exercise is burdened, the employers are asked to accommodate their beliefs unless it would disrupt the workplace. And so something similar applies now in Utah law to Utah employers. The other one is similar to that in the sense that it requires government employers. Now, obviously, there's some differences because there's some ways you really can't accommodate, first responders. They have a job they have to do no matter what. But there are some circumstances where there's public employees that are asked to do things that are against their conscience, and if it's relatively simple for the employer to accommodate that, the direction is they need to do that. So that basically, any adult and with past bills that we've done in Utah, most youth as well that want to act on their beliefs and the kind of normal living of their lives are protected by these kinds of laws.
Can I ask you a quick question about that,
course,
Bill?
Yeah.
Based on that description, it kind of sounds like these are two sides. This is two sides of the same coin. These two bills that one protect if you're a public employee, a government employee, then the government basically cannot force you to do something in the course of exercising your duties of your job that violates your conscience or religious beliefs, unless, as you said, there's a compelling interest and there's not a way to accommodate. And it sounds like it's the same thing on the private sector. So should we view these as almost two companion bills that say whether you're a government employee or a private sector employee, there are limits upon which your employer, whether it's government or private, can sort of make you do things in your job that might violate your conscience? Is that?
Yeah, that's definitely the way I see it. I'm not sure that was the intention of the spawn. They may have just thought of the same basic ideas, but there are some ways in which government employment is a little different. So it's justified to have a different rule, some different sort of rules to make that work. But yeah, that's exactly right. And I know in the case of House Bill 460, which is governs public employers, there were some specific concerns that had been brought to the sponsor, and he said, "Look, we need to do something about this to make sure our public employees get the same kind of protections that others have."
So how do you balance those things? Because that's something I've heard often when people talk about these kinds of workplace protections for the conscience of whether a public employee or a private employee, and some of the concerns that were brought up during this discussion and previous discussions about that balance. Well, what does this mean for when an employee can say no to something if that negatively impacts that organization's ability to perform its functions? What's a framework, and with as much specificity as is helpful, what's a framework to help answer that question of, well, how do you balance an employer needs to be able to do its job, but an employee should be able to live their conscience and their religious beliefs? Do these bills strike that balance? And if so, what is that?
Yeah. Well, let me, if you don't mind, if I start with maybe a specific example and then kind of show how that works. So the sponsor of House Bill 460 during the debate and the floor on this bill mentioned that he had been approached by someone who was, as I understand this situation, a graphic designer, and they worked for a public agency. And they were asked to do something that was, they just felt a little uncomfortable based on their beliefs. I don't know if it was a conscience thing or a religious thing, but felt uncomfortable to do. Their request was, well, couldn't someone else do this? Someone that kind of feels more comfortable with that message and sending that. And I'd rather not. It wouldn't have created any, it's not like I need a week off or this is going to create more work for anyone else. Just maybe swapping specific tasks. And the agency said, no, we can't do that. The entity that he was working for, and so he basically retired early because he was worried that he'd be asked to do things he didn't feel comfortable with. In this situation, there's very little downside for the employer just saying, oh, sure, why don't you just swap someone else? They love doing that kind of thing. That's their passion. Let them do it, and you do the more neutral, messaging. In those kinds of cases, it seems reasonable to accommodate those employees. And that's what the bill tries to do. It definitely, there is a recognition, of course, that an employer can't say, like it was one of the examples that was brought up in the committee on the private employer bill. I can't work at McDonald's because I'm a vegetarian. Well, of course, if you can't do what the core business, purpose is, then the employer doesn't have to accommodate you. The way that they do it is to say that if there's a substantial burden on the ability of the employer, either the public employer or the private employer, to do their work, then they don't have to make the accommodation. But if it's just a matter of saying, oh, sure, you want to get off a few minutes early to go to a religious observance, oh, that's fine. That kind of thing, that would be allowed. And we hope that, the reality of the bills is that not that they're going to have a lot of litigation and people trying to prove there was a burden, but that mostly what will happen is employers will say, oh, I never thought about that. I probably ought to be a little more open to what my employees are comfortable with, and just resolve the disputes or not resolve, prevent them before they ever happen.
Bill, I'm going to apply my non-attorney lens to this and I guess pretend to be an attorney for a second, because what you're saying,
that's great.
And from some of our previous conversations on the show, there's a key principle in the law that ought to be part of our political culture, which is it is the job of the employer or the government to accommodate a belief of conscience or a religious belief whenever they can, and if the accommodation of that would be unreasonable or would create undue burden or hardship on the employer, that's when they can say, well, no, we can't accommodate that. But is it kind of the same principle as basically if you're going to not accommodate or limit in some way a person's religious freedom or belief of conscience, whether it's in the workplace or in other circumstances, that you have to have, number one, a really compelling interest to do so. And if you're going to not accommodate or infringe, you have to do it in sort of the most targeted, reasonable way. So I'm wondering if those principles, if that's what's embedded in these bills, does that tie into the third bill, the SB 150, Exercise of Religion, the State Religious Freedom Restoration Act? Am I getting that right? Is that sort of a trend through the law that's consistent in these bills?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's obviously a recognition that the contexts are a little bit different. I mean, when you're telling a private employer what to do, you can't go too far with that. The SB 150 is sort of the mirror image of those, where it's saying, now we're talking about a situation where the government itself is creating the burden on someone's religious beliefs. And in that case, the kinds of concerns that we would have about not making it harder on employers, allowing them to kind of function without interference, those rules don't really apply, because the government should not be interfering with anybody's religious freedom for almost any reason. There's some extreme cases, and that's the idea, as you mentioned, a compelling interest. But if we're not talking about a government regulation that's needed to protect public health or safety, in that case, I think correctly say, yeah, government really shouldn't be in that business at all. They need to allow people to practice their beliefs. They facilitate that, of course, in the employment context, but understanding that in that context, which is a little bit different, there'll need to be some kind of common sense exceptions to allow employers to still do what they need to do as well.
So, Bill, as we start to wrap up our conversation, what's the one big thing that folks need to remember about what the legislature did this year with respect to religious freedom? Was it a win for religious freedom? I mean, Sutherland was involved in these pieces of legislation, leveraged your research and expertise. And so just tell our listeners, was it a good year? Is there anything else still remaining that we need to do? Give us some kind of final takeaways from the session.
It was a really good year. I mean, this is about as positive a single session in terms of just protections of religious freedom and making as broad a protections as possible so that almost everybody now can feel that their religious freedom is going to be respected by the government. So for the future, there are still, even with broad blanket protections that kind of serve as a backstop when a situation arises we don't see, it's good for us to be thinking about what kinds of kind of more predictable challenges we have. In the past, for instance, Sutherland has supported bills that protect students who want to wear more modest uniforms in athletics because of their religious beliefs or just because of their conscience. And so those kinds of situations are things we're always on the lookout for to determine what could we do to just prevent any possibility that someone might not only have their religious freedom burdened, but they might feel that they're not that the state is not understanding of their unique beliefs, and we want to ensure that happens. So we're going to be looking at some specific kinds of things that we could avoid, conflicts we could avoid in the future, and of course more general constitutional freedom issues too. So.
Well, Bill, thank you again for coming on and giving us sort of this rundown of some of the religious freedom policy wins this session. We really appreciate your time and expertise.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We're going to continue the conversation about the legislative session and what was passed and how it's going to impact Utahns. Again, thanks to Bill Duncan, our constitutional law and religious freedom fellow here at Sutherland Institute. Coming up next, we're going to talk about elections, family policy, and more with respect to the successful legislative session relative to some of the things that Sutherland worked on and helped with this past couple months. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. We're going to finish our discussion about what was passed during this year's legislative session here in Utah and how it affects all of us moving forward. We're going to talk specifically about family policy and elections and some really compelling survey data talking about what likely voters care about and how that's going to influence this election year we're in right now. But first, I want to remind you, if you're enjoying this episode, please visit defendingideas.org. You can find access to short clips from previous episodes, including this episode, that you can use in your conversations with friends and family and share on your own social media channels. You can also find links to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, all of the major platforms. Basically, wherever you like to listen to podcasts, just search for Defending Ideas and hit that subscribe button. You can also watch on YouTube and subscribe to the Sutherland YouTube channel. Once again, that's all on defendingideas.org. Well, joining us now in the studio is Derek Monson. He's the Chief Growth Officer here at Sutherland. He also oversees our policy operations and has done a lot of work on things like elections policy and has been watching the legislation closely that passed this past session. So, Derek, thanks for joining us on Defending Ideas as we get into some of these issues.
I'm glad to be here.
So we want to talk specifically about family policy and elections and then go over some survey data. And so we've got some really good overviews from Christine and from Bill and Stan at the beginning about the various ways Sutherland was involved this legislative session to try and help inform debate around some of these critical pieces of legislation. So maybe to start, give us a quick overview of what happened with respect to family policy that Sutherland was involved with. Is this session, can we view it as a win for families?
I definitely think so. There were some good steps forward taken on family policy, two of which we were directly involved with. One was a resolution supporting the success sequence, the idea that if you graduate high school, work full-time, and get married before you have kids, if you choose to have kids, that you will be out of poverty at a 97% clip and more than 9 in 10, regardless of gender, race, other socioeconomic status, growing up, and those kinds of things. And so this resolution not only supported that, a little bit of a symbolic measure, but it asked the Utah State Board of Education to look at how we can take the concept, the facts of the success sequence, that 97% figure, for instance, and incorporate it into public school classrooms in the curriculum we teach, so that the same way we teach kids about the facts about health, about financial well-being and the financial literacy courses and civics and all those kinds of things that allow them to then make their own decisions and lead the lives that they want. They ought to have this information as well about their life decisions and what the impacts of those are, which, people maybe intuitively already understand, but putting numbers to it, making this stark comparison of, everything you hear about gaps in racial economic outcomes is not the same when you follow this sequence. That's a striking thing. And so putting it in those terms can potentially impact people and reach kids in ways that might be more difficult to do otherwise. So that legislation passed and passed broad margins, which was encouraging to see. Another bill created officially within the structure of the state government an Office of Families. This is something that the governor had done by executive order previously as a kind of informal advisor office in his office. And this legislation put it within the state structure of the Department of Health and Human Services. And the reason this is important is in the social science research, it is very clear that family structure matters for any number of outcomes: education, economic, social, emotional, mental health, all those kinds of issues. But we don't track that in state reporting and state data collection. We track a lot of stuff that's important, but that's one that we don't. And it's plain when you look into research that it is critical. And so what this office is going to do, in addition to looking at policy ideas and examining solutions that help families economically and socially and otherwise for the purposes of the governor's office and the Department of Health, it's going to start collecting some of this data that in some cases we're already collecting. The Department of Health does an annual survey where they collect some of this information, but it hasn't been focused on and publicly reported in a way that allows us to understand the impact of family on health outcomes. And being in the Department of Health, they're going to naturally collect that information. The Office of Families under this new law is also empowered to go and collect that information from other entities. For instance, when you look at how much tax revenue comes from married households versus not married households, it's pretty dramatic where, where's the bread buttered, as they say, for the state. And so when we create policy around taxes that neglects that reality, we may be actually hurting ourselves long-term by unintended consequences of how we encourage or discourage family formation. And so again, it's collecting this information, getting it out there, just helping people understand, policymakers as well as the public, the impact that family has on policy. And there will be few steps in the future on both of these arenas, that we need to take. But these are good starts, and so it's a step in the right direction.
Derek, one of the things that strikes me about those two bills in particular is it seems to be focusing on how can we empower people and strengthen the actual institutions themselves. So in this case, family, as you're talking about, there are of course other programs that are ancillary to families that try and provide support. But these bills specifically, is there information we can bring to bear that will actually help to strengthen families themselves and how policy impacts those things, and also empower people with information. And if you look at it as kind of two columns, that the success sequence and providing information about the economic outcomes of the success sequence to young people is essentially, we're saying we're going to give more information to young people that's going to help them make decisions about their lives. And then on the other side, incorporating family structure data reporting in government reports and all that publicly accessible data is providing more information to policymakers. And so we're essentially saying whether you're a young person starting your life or you're a person who is elected to help make decisions, we want to make sure both of those groups have better information about the importance of families and the impact of family structure so that they can make decisions that will affect either their own lives or Utahns if they're a policymaker. So I just want to highlight that and ask you to expand on that if there's anything that stands out to you, but that this is information on multiple levels that's helping to emphasize the importance of family stability for outcomes for everyone.
That's right. From either the life standpoint or from the policymaking standpoint, the decisions you make and the quality and the outcomes of those decisions is in significant measure driven by the information upon which you're making those decisions. So if we have good information, it doesn't always guarantee a good outcome in a person's life or in a policy decision. But it makes it a lot more likely than if we're making decisions in a vacuum of information where we simply don't really know what we're getting into, and then lots of potential problems can come up. So that's what this really is making sure we have the information to make wise decisions in policy, in various realms of policy, again, be it economic, education, health, or directly family policy related to things like marriage and divorce and those kinds of things, as well as, again, empowering people to have that information themselves to make their life decisions.
So let's shift gears for a minute and talk about elections policy. Of course, in recent years, how we vote, the security of those votes, it has been a topic of conversation, and there's, of course, been a lot of controversy around that. And not to get into too much controversy, but there were some pieces of legislation this past session that looked at that looked at refining in some ways just how we cast our ballots here in Utah. Can you give us a quick rundown of a couple of the things that were discussed, and what do our listeners need to know about what did or didn't make it out of the session this year?
Yeah, there were multiple bills that really ran in the election policy space, but two of significant note were an effort to end the municipal ranked choice voting pilot program. And that's a program that's slated to go through the 2025 municipal election cycle. There was an effort to end it now so that it wouldn't go in 2025. And that effort passed in the House and then did not pass in the Senate. And the other one was an effort to restrict vote by mail in a variety of ways. It kind of evolved over time, but ultimately it was about making vote by mail something that was less the default option than either an opt-in option or something that you could lose the privilege of, the easy access to if you showed a track record not voting. And both those efforts failed. And really, I think what that reflected, and this is based on my own observation as well as some polling data that we did on both of these issues, was that those election proposals did not reflect the broad experience of voters in the state of Utah. So in the ranked choice voting example, there's roughly a dozen cities that continue to use ranked choice voting over the last several cycles. And so that means the large majority of cities haven't opted in, haven't used ranked choice voting. And there have been a number of cities that have tried it out, not like their experience, and backed out. But the idea that we should therefore just end it means the experience of those dozen cities that continue to like it and see the benefits of it is simply being ignored. And I think that generated a lot of pushback in the Senate, that we're just taking this away preemptively and without really examining why the cities that want to keep it, In the vote by mail context, there has been, Utah has organically grown vote by mail to the point where today it's the default option. That started out as a small pilot program about a dozen years ago. And again, it's grown since then, and voters have become very comfortable with it. In polling we did on this issue, we asked how confident are Utah likely voters that their ballots are being counted accurately in their vote by mail, and about 80% of people, voters said they are confident. They said at a similar rate that they're confident it produces fair outcomes, and a little over 70% said they think vote by mail elections are secure. The idea that therefore we need to restrict vote by mail and access to it significantly just doesn't jibe with that reality, right? And so I think you had a lot of pushback on that as well. And you saw similar things with our ranked choice voting poll, where we asked people, do you want to see ranked choice voting as an option in your city? And it was kind of 50-50 split. But among those who had used ranked choice voting before, that support went up significantly. And among those who hadn't used it, it dropped. So again, this idea to end the ranked choice voting pilot program was reflecting that one side of that experience, saying we don't like it, but we haven't really had much experience with it. And so when you do that and you're not reflecting a consensus of people, bills tend to have some struggles somewhere along the way. And that was kind of what was going on, I think, with both those.
Another theme that's coming to mind, Derek, is that these various pieces of the legislation, I think the same could be said for the education content we talked about with Christine, the religious freedom legislation we talked about with Bill, that a lot of these pieces of legislation that Sutherland engaged on and helped to inform are really the ones that passed are really those that strengthen sort of fundamental pillars of our society here in America, of our institutions, whether we're talking about protecting religious freedom, helping to strengthen families through wise policymaking, protecting election procedures, how we cast our vote in a way that's secure and aligned with Utahns' experiences. You go down the list and there are so many things that stand out to me as really strengthening or protecting or building up these core institutions of American democracy. And it's actually very encouraging when politics can be, of course, so frustrating at times, to see this list of things that happened in the legislative session that protected those institutions.
It really is. I mean, we have a good system in place here and a good, solid culture, both politically and otherwise, to support a functional process that allows for real issues to be addressed, and issues that are maybe more controversial but don't have a lot of substance to them to kind of, fall by the wayside. Or if they get addressed, it's not ultimately very impactful on many people.
That ties into the last thing I wanted to ask you about, and also because we're talking about elections, we're of course in an election year. Folks are thinking deeply. Hopefully, we're all thinking deeply about candidates and how we're going to cast our vote at every level. And so the latest issue brief on some polling data that you've referenced and we talked about earlier with Christine on Utah voter priorities for the 2024 election. We'll link to this in the show notes just to remind folks you can go through and look at these in detail. But asking likely voters in Utah, what are the top issues that you're concerned about that will affect how you vote in 2024? And I'd love just your general thoughts on these, that the ones that rose to the top, perhaps unsurprisingly, housing, education, and taxes. And those are, of course, kind of bedrock issues. What surprised me, and this is what I'd love your thoughts on, is things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and its presence in higher education was at the bottom of the list. And tech regulation, which is another one that's drawn some controversy, was pretty low as well. And so did anything surprise you about this, of where likely voters say this is the level of importance we place on various issues?
I wouldn't say it surprised me. It simply verified what is, I think, the common sense conclusion, but that can be maybe doubted if you look just at what gets traction on social media or sometimes in the news, activist kind of perspectives that show up in the news reporting or in the op-ed pages. And that's that voters care most in terms of impacting the vote they're going to cast. They care most about stuff that impacts their lives significantly. And when you look across the population as a whole, that's going to be these bread and butter issues of how much does it cost to buy or rent a home? Are my kids' schools being funded adequately? And what's my taxes look like? How much of my income am I losing to taxes? And while issues like DEI and higher education and regulation of technology, social media, AI, those kinds of things have impacts clearly on people's lives. It's not that they don't. It's just in a comparison way. If you had a teeter-totter or a scale, it would be heavy in one direction in terms of the significance of the impact and the breadth of that impact. So from that standpoint, it's not surprising. It's, again, what a common sense, I think, conclusion. If you looked at your own life, what do you care about the most? In most cases, it's going to be things like the top issues on our poll. But it is surprising from the standpoint what you see focused on so much in the political narrative. And that just actually speaks to how much our political narrative is driven by polarizing factors, and that we ought to recognize that reality, especially if you're a policymaker going into an election year. If you think it's all about these controversial issues, you're likely to run a campaign that's going to be out of touch with the voters you're trying to get. And so that's going to probably cause you some problems down the road.
So is it fair to say that basically if I'm imagining that I'm a policymaker, that these other things that you're saying that are maybe toward the bottom of the list, it's not that they are without importance and impact. They should be addressed in a thoughtful way. But if I'm a policymaker, I need to stay anchored to these kitchen table issues, the things that really affect people's lives in a direct way, and as evidenced by the survey data. And again, housing and education and taxes is just the top 3 on this list. Those are pretty foundational issues that I think if you were to look back in previous survey data from a number of organizations here in Utah, and probably throughout the country for that matter, those are pretty consistently important issues. So is it fair to say that it's maybe, just to encapsulate what you said, it's not about picking which issues to ignore and which issues to engage on, but just sort of ranking your focus appropriately, knowing that if I'm a policymaker, I need to be aware of what my constituents are really worried about. What are their pain points? And same with if I'm a member of the press, the things that I cover, I should be aware of what's top of mind for voters. And then even myself as a voter, look at my own experience. Does that sort of match with this? Are these things important to me as well? And vote accordingly.
That's right. Another way of looking at it is, in principle, our constitutional system, representative government, representative democracy system, is designed to translate the will of the people, the pain points you're talking about, the things that voters are interested in, into policy decisions that bring consensus, so that we're not in a situation, which happens in some countries, where it's just you have to resort to violence to keep people from revolting, or some ways to express these passions that doesn't turn towards things like violence and destruction of society. And so things like this, recognition of these facts, that the voters care most about what is broadly impacting them, particularly, on a day-to-day basis, their kids, their families, their finances. And we ought to focus our energies most there, while still addressing these other important issues that may be a little more controversial, which again, like the legislature addressed all these issues in our survey at some level, one way or another. But again, the question becomes, are we adequately reflecting what the voters care about the most? And it's not simply about winning votes. That's something that our system requires, obviously, to get elected. But it's about, are we doing what our system is designed to do, which is create a free society that can be self-governed, whether at a state, local, federal level. And in order for that to happen, you have to reflect the considerations, the concerns in a consensus-building way of the voters and the people who you're representing.
Well, Derek, I think we can end on an optimistic note. I'm going to choose to be optimistic in the contentious election year, that these kinds of issues, and really this kind of data and information that we're providing from Sutherland, and a lot of the information that was provided around these bills we talked about, that these are the kinds of things we need to be having conversations about. That the controversial stuff is fun, and yes, sometimes it matters a lot, but it's these kitchen table issues that we need to be examining how we can actually govern or self-govern in a way that makes a real difference for most Utahns, as you said. I like that term you used, the in a consensus building kind of way. So hopefully that'll happen this coming election year, and we'll provide some data and analysis to help bring that to pass. So thanks for lending your expertise to help us work through these issues from the session, and for what's still going to be top of mind for folks this election year.
Thank you.
Well, we're going to take one more final break before we leave you with some final thoughts about all these issues we talked about. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we close out this episode, there's really kind of one key takeaway that I want to share, and that's that Sutherland Institute this session was involved with legislation that did a number of things, such as strengthening religious freedom, supporting families, improving education, and protecting Utah's successful election procedures. Now, all these things tie together in my mind because they're all bedrock issues important to American democracy and to the success of our country and to our state here in Utah. And they ought to be top of mind for each of us moving forward this year and beyond. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode and that you feel better equipped to defend some of the ideas we talked about today. If you want to follow Defending Ideas, please visit us at defendingideas.org or search for Defending Ideas in your favorite podcast platform like Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify. Wherever you listen, just search for Defending Ideas and click subscribe. And don't forget to share some of the short clips on YouTube and Twitter and Instagram from this episode and previous shows as you engage on these issues with your friends and family on your own social media accounts. Again, that's defendingideas.org. That will do it for this episode of Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.